everybody. A big, hearty, warm welcome from the Rural Assembly, and welcome to The Road to Repair. My name is Nikki Finney, and I have been asked to open these honorable, auspicious, critical proceedings over the next few days. And I'd like to think that any organization who invites a poet to open up such conversations, well, it must say something about that organization being on the right road. So here are your marching instructions. I hope you take them very seriously as I did when I wrote them. Instruction final. Be a camera, black-eyed aperture. Be diamond-back terrapin, the only animal that can outrun a hurricane. Be 250 million years old. Be Isosceles, Cirrus, Rhapsody, Hogan, Dogon, Hubble. Stay hot. Create a pleasure that can stir up the world. Study the moon with a pencil. Drink the ephemerides. Lay with the almanacs. Become the lunations. Look up the word southing before you use it in a sentence. No, southing is not a verb. Imitate them remarkable days. Locate all your ascending nodes. Chew 8 times before you swallow the lyrics and silver lamentations of James Brown, Abbey Lincoln, Al Green, Curtis Mayfield, and Aretha. Hey, watch your language. 2 1/4 is not the same as deuce and a quarter. Two-fisted is not two-faced. Remember, one monkey don't stop no show. Let your fat belly be quilts of quietus. Pass on what the great winemakers know. The juice is not made in the vats, but in the vineyard. Keep yourself rooted in the sun, rain, and darkly camphored air. Grow until you die, but before you do, leave your final kiss. Lay mint or orange eucalyptus garland, double tuck those lips. Careful to the very end, what you deny, dismiss, and cut away. Now, I have spoken the very best I know how. Now, let's go to work.
Hi friends, welcome to Rural Assembly Everywhere. We're so glad you're joining us for this virtual festival that's meant to inform, inspire, entertain, and demonstrate how we all belong to one another. Rural Assembly Everywhere is a program of the Rural Assembly and the Center for Rural Strategies. Since 2008, or 2007 rather, the Rural Assembly has been building a movement of rural leaders, advocates, and partners to usher in a more inclusive and more just nation, a nation that values all the people in all the places. At the Assembly, this looks a lot like gatherings, collaborations, media and content production, and showing up over and over again to advocate for rural and Native people and places at the national level. Rural Assembly Everywhere, this event, was born out of the pandemic. It is a way for us to gather together safely and with the purpose of staying in relationship. Last October, we hosted a 5-day Everywhere event that included speakers and conversations from across the country and across sectors. And today and tomorrow, we'll keep this new tradition going. Speakers and panelists will lift up stories and strategies that we can inscribe on our hearts as we travel the road to repairing our nation, our democracy, and our relationships. I can't think of a better way to kick off this event than with the voices of women who wield hope with words and with stories. We just heard from the incredible Nikki Finney, poet and National Book Award winner, and it is now my pleasure to introduce you to another writer and poet, my sister from Tennessee, Margaret Wrinkle, Over the next half hour or so, Margaret and I are going to have a conversation, and I encourage all of you who are listening to please add your thoughts to our conversation by posting them in your reflections in the chat. So the chat feature on whatever platform you're streaming from is where participation can happen in real time. And toward the end of our discussion, I'll start taking questions from the audience. So please drop your questions for Margaret, for me, in that chat, and we'll receive them. And one more thing I want to note, if you need or desire a closed caption experience today, please hop over to our YouTube channel. A link to that platform has been posted and will continue to be posted in the chat features. So, okay, let's get started. Margaret, would you join me on the Zoom stage?
Hi, Whitney.
Hi, I'm so glad you're here.
I'm so happy to be here.
So for the audience, I'm sure people have read your bio. Many of them read your column or your opinion column weekly in the New York Times. Maybe people have picked up your book of late migrations, but just so everyone knows, Margaret Rinkle is a longtime writer and op-ed or opinion writer for the New York Times and has been for several years. And we're so glad to have her here so we can talk a bit about her latest or her 2019 book, Late Migrations. And I know you have another book coming out too, so we can talk a little bit about that. But I was telling you in the green room beforehand, like I woke up this morning and I thought, I get to talk to Margaret Rinkle. My life is bliss is made right now. So thank you for saying yes.
That's so funny.
And I said you're a sister from Tennessee. You live right outside of Nashville, I believe, and so much of your writing is it centers, I think, on your backyard and the critters and birds and flora and fauna that live back there with you. And I wonder if writing about nature and what's in your backyard has always been what you felt called to do, or if you've kind of found your voice over time in those subjects.
When I was a little girl, I wanted to be two things. The first two things I wanted to be was, I wanted to be a large animal veterinarian like my hero Dixie Klein. DVM, there was a those little biographies in children's school libraries. That dream was not realistic because I'm not very good at dissection, it turns out. But really, I found out that there was such a thing as being a naturalist. Like, I don't know where I found that out, but I thought that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be somebody who got to be outside, and then I wanted to, and I was writing stories, so I thought, well, that's what I would write stories about, and that is what I wrote about, really right up through college, and really even graduate school. But when my children came along, that was a lot more absorbing for me. And they were kind of little wild creatures. And so I wrote about them for a long time until they could read. And then I, didn't want me to write about them anymore. So as they've gotten older, I've found myself returning to the original love I had for writing about the natural world. And the natural world for me is just blue jays and mockingbirds and chipmunks. It's not grizzly bears.
Well, for your columns in the New York Times, I mean, I've been following you since 2018, and maybe you've been available in the Times before then, but for a long time I've been reading what you put out there, and I was trying to think of some way to describe the scope of topics you tend to cover in a way that might be different than the way Ann Patchett has talked about you, or Richard Power, or even Oprah. I've seen all these rave reviews about you from them. But I was thinking about one of the first columns I ever read of yours. It was about Graceland, and you eventually got to go visit Elvis Presley's home in Graceland. And then you also write about birds and the bird feeder in your backyard, and then you also write about like the Christmas Day disaster that occurred just this last year in Nashville with the bomb going off downtown, and how that affected, the whole region. So the scope of your writing is more than the natural world, but with late migrations in particular, you seem to have found a way to weave together your sense of the moment and the place that we live in, and the time and history that we live in, and also the natural world. So tell me about the joining of those two things, or those many things, I guess, with natural world.
Well, one of the things that's kind of a great advantage to being an essayist is that the investment of time in any one topic isn't really that great. So and I think of myself as a generalist. I don't have a mind that is interested in specialization. So the essay form is really comfortable for me, because I get to learn something almost every week. I get to learn something new. And for Monday, my column this coming Monday will be about a wonderful sculptor who died in 1951, who was the son of enslaved people and also the first Black artist to have a solo show at MoMA. That's something that I get to learn about this week and then write about it. And then, maybe next week it'll be something completely different, but it doesn't have to be really coherent. I'm not writing a 400-page novel. I'm just writing about what presents itself before me. People ask all the time, are you worried about running out of something to write about for the Times? And I'm not, because the world is so fascinating and always changing. As far as the book goes, though, I didn't really think I was writing one book. I thought I was writing one set of essays about my childhood and my family, and another set of essays about the natural world, because after my mom died very suddenly, I found myself really taking so much comfort from following the natural cycles of life and death. And it was really a couple of writer friends who said, you're writing a book. And when they pointed it out, I could see that these were different facets of the same kind of thinking. The human realm of love and loss and the natural cycles of life and death really do kind of go together.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your growing up. Many of the essays, as you mentioned, in Late Migrations are about your childhood in Lower Alabama. What can you tell us about your childhood?
I was born in Andalusia, Alabama, which is in Covington County. And my grandparents lived in Clopton, Alabama, which is in Dale County. And the Andalusia was and still is a small town. Clopton is strictly a farming community. One little general store, one little Methodist church with a graveyard, and what was once upon a time a 2-room schoolhouse where my grandmother was the school teacher, and is now a community, just a little community house for family reunions and church bazaars and stuff. And we went back and forth between those two poles of my childhood, the little house in town and the rambling, often added on to country house where my grandparents lived, in the house where my grandfather grew up and my mother grew up, with my great-grandmother in the house. So it was a multi-generational thing. My mother struggled with depression when I was a little girl, and there were times when she really couldn't take care of us, and we spent really big chunks of time with my grandparents. And so on the farm, my grandfather was a peanut and a cattle farmer. And as I said, my grandmother was the school teacher. And then even after we moved to Birmingham, when I was in first grade, we still spent weeks and weeks every summer in Clopton, and at least one weekend a month during the school year. So I thought of both of those places as my hometown.
Hmm. And part of your story too is leaving the South and moving north to go to school. I think it's maybe where you met is that where you met your husband?
No, thank goodness.
No.
I
Okay.
last very long. My mother was terrified that I was going to go to Philadelphia, and as she put it, you're just going to marry a Yankee and never come home. And that's not what happened. I didn't last very long in Philadelphia. I only lived there. I was 4 months, and then
Mm-hmm.
I transferred to the University of South Carolina, which was still not home, but familiar territory.
It was
And
the South. Yeah.
yeah, and that's where I met my husband.
Okay. Well, that story feels kind of familiar to me too, of
Really?
leaving home to go to school and discovering while I was gone how important the culture of the place, the history I had in the South, how my comfort was there, and so returning home became very important to me too. So we call ourselves homecomers, I think. Um,
How long did
so
you stay away?
I was away for almost a decade
Oh, wow.
before I could make it back. So coming home it felt like homecoming, for sure. And so now I'm back in Athens, Tennessee. I wondered if you would read for us just a little bit from an essay in Late Migrations. It's where you describe a bit of your home. It's an essay called Jaybird Home, actually. And maybe the last two paragraphs or so of this essay, I think people would really resonate.
Yeah, this essay is about um, it's really about how the landscape of your earliest years. You I think so many people I know I've heard from so many people who've had the same experience, but with a different landscape. That the trees and the birds and the quality of the soil, and whether it's flat or hilly, um, it you imprint on that, and it becomes a part of you. And that's what this essay is really about. It's called Jaybird Home, Lower Alabama, 1968. It would take all the words in remembrance of things past to catalog what I remember about the place where I was born. But there are three things that can bring it all back to me in startling detail: the sight of a red dirt road, the smell of pine needles, and the sound of a blue jay's call. And of those three, by far the most powerful is the call of the jaybird. I love the blue jay's warning call, the jeer, 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 jeer it makes when a hawk is near. I love the softer wheedle, 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 and please, please song for its mate. Blue jays have an immense range of vocalizations, whirring and clicking and churring and whistling and whining, and something you would swear was a whisper. But the sound they make that takes me right back to 1968 is a call that mimics a squeaky screen door hinge. I hear that sound coming from the top of a pine tree, and instantly I am in the wiregrass region of Lower Alabama, where the soil is red sand and pine needles make a scented bower fit for all my imagined homes.
Thank you for that. It's so descriptive and pulls on all the senses to call us back to a place. I'm wondering about, you had said you wanted to be perhaps a veterinarian growing up, or work with animals, but then you discovered maybe you wanted to be a poet. And as I read your words, I can see the poetry in them. And I also wonder about your family, and were they supportive of your desire to pursue poetry, writing, and reading? You said they were in the acknowledgments. You say they are your safety net and your trampoline, your family.
My my father was convinced I was going to be a lawyer because I have a strongly argumentative streak that was directed toward him quite a lot during my adolescence. And I had a teacher, a beloved high school English teacher who died the summer after I graduated from high school and after a long illness. And I instantly decided I wasn't gonna go in that direction. I had planned to major in journalism and then go to law school. Instead, I majored in English and started writing poetry. And well, I wasn't really starting. I've been writing. Don't all adolescents write poetry? I think everybody does, especially if they fall in love. But I got serious about it in college, and my dad was so wonderful. It was such a lesson for me later in life as a parent that the second I said, nope, it's not going to be law, it's going to be poetry, which is not something you imagine a father would really welcome hearing. And he just switched instantly and started sending me clippings from the newspaper about poets and poetry books that were being reviewed in the Birmingham News. And so they were kind of insufferably supportive. I mean, I think when the internet was invented, Dad finally had, a modem. And I was writing a weekly column for a newspaper here in town, the Nashville Scene. He would just be refreshing it every Wednesday morning, waiting for it to come up. Yes, very, very supportive.
I love that. It's wonderful. Well, shifting gears just a little bit, something else I read about, I think it was an interview with you, where somebody suggested that you are the voice of the South, and you take issue with that characterization of your writing, that there are many voices of the South. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the Southern voice. And one other thing I have to share with everyone out there is there's a wonderful column you've written for the New York Times about this very topic. I think that maybe I'll read a little bit from in just a little bit. But if you could speak a little bit to this idea of being a voice from the South.
I think I am a voice from the South. It's customary, especially for people living in rural areas and small towns, to believe, and I think this is true, that the newspaper and, well, media in general covers our region primarily by sending somebody, they call it parachuting in, sending somebody either from, New York, the center of American publishing, or those publications based in news and television news shows based in New York, sending somebody to be based in Atlanta or to be based in Nashville and then sending them out, where they don't really have any experience of the nuances of life here. And so I think being from the South does help me a lot in how I think about the complexities of this region and the writing I do about it. But when people say you're the voice for the South, that is, or the voice of the South, that's just not true. I mean, I think people who say that just don't know how many writers we have down here, or how many. I mean, it's kind of amazing how many novelists and poets and journalists and spoken word artists and playwrights. It's like crazy how fertile the literary life of the South is, and the idea that I would be I just have a really huge platform is all, but there are plenty of other people who write about the South, and the thing that really kind of bugs me about that question more than anything is the implication that the South is this monolithic entity, that it's just this one thing that any old white woman in Nashville could possibly represent. I mean, that's not who we are. I mean, there's just a lot of Souths. Anybody who is inclined to lump Appalachia with the Gulf Coast or the Mississippi Delta or the Piedmont of Alabama, much less Middle Tennessee. It's just not possible. There's so many, and all those Souths have their own identity and their own voices, and those voices are old and young and black and white and brown and Native Americans and Southern born Americans and immigrants to the South. I mean, it's just complex. Nobody could ever do that. Nobody can ever be the voice of that.
Mm-hmm. And what do you feel like is yours to bring to this platform that you have from the South? What is the message that maybe consciously or unconsciously perhaps you're weaving into everything that you put out there?
I try to use this platform as much as I can to really to do two things: to amplify other voices that people who read the Times might not have heard of, but also to muddy expectations as much as I can. I want people who think they know us because they've watched every episode of Andy Griffith or the Dukes of Hazzard, or even Nashville, the nighttime soap opera that was set here 6 or 7 years. You don't know us. I want you to be surprised by what you find out about this region.
I love that. I think I will, if folks don't mind, read just a tiny bit from one of the columns that you wrote. That it talks about what is a Southern writer anyway, is the question that you wrote under. And you said, people can hardly help loving the hands that rocked their cradles or the landscapes that shaped their souls. But I doubt there's a single writer in the South for whom life here isn't a source of deep ambivalence. And yet all the writers you've mentioned in the column had opportunities to leave. Many actually did leave for a time before returning to stay. And all this has made me wonder, what if being a Southern writer has nothing to do with rural tropes or lyrical prose or a lush landscape or humid heat so thick it's hard to breathe? What if being a Southern writer is foremost a matter of growing up in a deeply troubled place and yet finding it somehow impossible to leave, of seeing clearly the failings of home and nevertheless refusing to flee? Part of what I just love about this piece too is the acknowledgement that the South is not perfect, but we're staying, or we're naming and claiming it in all of its glory and in all of its imperfections. And that's something you tend to do over and over again, and you're able to walk that line. Is that hard? Is that a hard thing to do?
I think for me, it's just the nature of love. I mean, that is what love is, isn't it? I mean, I've been married for almost 33 years. I mean, I know my spouse, warts and all, and he knows me. And, I think about how many people are just so forgiving of their beloved dog that, barks unceasingly or jumps on people or digs holes in the treasured flower beds. I mean, this is what love is. It's knowing the flaws and loving in spite of them, because there's still so much to love, even when you acknowledge that there is so much that is troubled and that is painful and that should be changed.
And there has been a lot of pain in the last year, and a lot of, I don't know if revelation is the right word, a lot of the issues we've been dealing with in the South and beyond have been ongoing for many generations. But maybe the pandemic in some ways and the call for racial justice seems to have placed a more intense spotlight on them, on those issues and that we struggle with here. So I wonder how the pandemic and all of its attending factors have informed your writing and what you're thinking about how has it influenced you in this last year?
I think one of the things that's happened in the last year with the racial justice issues is that people are finally beginning to acknowledge that we don't have a patent on racism down here. It's and if people were listening to Black people, they would have known that a long time ago. Right now, we're waiting for a verdict in the trial in Minnesota. But there's all through last summer, you saw what happened in Washington D.C. and New York City, in Boston. It's our legacy, no doubt, because of the legacy of slavery, but it's not only ours. And maybe the pandemic, I don't know about this, maybe the pandemic, because we were all at home and because we weren't as easily distracted, maybe it made people register that in a way that they hadn't before. I don't know. I do think that the pandemic had at least one. I don't want to say that the pandemic was a good thing in any way. There's nothing about it that was good. But what people did with their time when they were stuck at home, so many people I've heard from hung up a bird feeder, or there's only so much time you can spend in front of a screen. And so they were standing at the window, and that didn't matter whether they were in a suburban neighborhood or a small town or a farm or a cabin in the woods or a city skyscraper. There's always something to see in the natural world. And so I hope that will translate. I've had this belief for a long time that the reason most people aren't attentive to what the natural world needs for human beings is because they were so busy with their own more urgent needs and responsibilities. And maybe this pandemic has made more people fall in love with the creatures who share our world, and that would be the first step to preserving or to taking steps to help.
I will just say that late migrations came into my hands during this time, and I know you didn't write it for the pandemic or during the pandemic, or somehow it speaks directly to even more closely to me during this period. The grief and the loss that is woven throughout as your mother moved on, and also the nod to the natural world all throughout, and then also just kind of this homecoming and sense of rootedness. I feel like a lot of those things were swirling around for many of us during the pandemic too. We do have a question from the audience that I wanted to drop in here. If you don't mind, I'm going to read it, and if I need to read it again or clarify, let me know. Okay. It says, you wrote in the New York Times after the election, "It is a great gift to see a future full of possibility again. But the fact that 71 people voted for Donald Trump should be, for everyone who voted for Mr. Biden, a cause for profound and pervasive grief, concern. I don't know if this country can ever be healed, but I do know that people whose hearts are full of grief have no room left for hatred, and that might be a place to start." So do you have any thoughts on how we begin this healing? And I guess that could also speak to the theme of this conference about repair, healing and repair. Where do we start?
Well, to me, the thing that is undeniable about those 71 million, and when I wrote that, it was 71 million. I think it ultimately ended up being 74 million or somewhere closer to that number, is that I think a lot of people, and I include myself, believed that the truth about Donald Trump would become clear over the years. He came in, he was a public figure, but he was not a leader. And so it would take some time for people to realize what this philosophy of education was going to do to the country and do for them. And I was really pretty shocked that that didn't happen. I fully expected that many of the people I knew who, and people I love, who voted for him would be changed by 2020, and some of them were. Quite a few people I know were troubled, not really so much about the philosophical positions of taxation um, and regulation and those issues, but we're just very upset about the division that he inspired among people, and either sat out the election or voted for President Biden. But so many didn't, and trying to find a way to talk to each other is very, very hard, because those battle lines have now been drawn for a long time, and our sources of information are so divergent now. And what I say is reality, and what plenty of people I know say is reality, those realities have no overlap at all. And that's the great challenge: is how do we reach each other across a divide like that? And one of the things that I think is hopeful is that uh, the social media companies seem to be becoming a little more alarmed about how this works now. And I feel, at least, that there's just a lot less just fury flying around Facebook and Twitter than there used to be. And if the fury can die down, then we can see what we do have in common, which is almost everything. I mean, we are all human beings. We love the people we love, and we want the best for them, and we are trying to do right by our kids and our communities, and we don't always agree what that is, how to do right, what that looks like, but we do agree that that's important. And that's a huge starting point for me, is recognizing what we have in common. Even if it's just, can you give me that mac and cheese recipe you brought to the potluck? That's a starting point.
Thank you. We have another question from, I think, a journalist in the field. Margaret, you mentioned journalists parachuting into rural areas to cover stories, resulting in a lack of proper context and resulting coverage. Do you think we see the same issue with academics who study rural America from suburban or metropolitan higher ed institutions?
I don't know that I'm qualified to answer that question, because I don't know a lot about how scholars work, but the scholars I know, what they are drawn to write about is what has mattered to them personally. So I have one of my dearest friends it teaches ethics, and a philosophy professor. Another is my brother is an art professor. Another good friend is an English professor. They don't just randomly pick things to write about. They are to focus on it. You don't accidentally become an expert in. I have a dear childhood friend who died a few years ago, whose specialty was how the South stopped being Democratic and became Republican. That was his area of study for years, and it's because of where he came from and who his grandparents were, and so I think my guess would just be, even though I'm totally just guessing, is that people write about the rural South because that is, in some fundamental way, who they are. Which would be different from a journalist going, okay, I want to cover this shooting in Nashville, or I'm gonna, go find out about this INS raid on, a meatpacking plant in East Tennessee or whatever.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate that perspective. And, when I think about Rural Assembly everywhere, and just Rural Assembly, the program, I mean, understanding that making space for all of these, for anyone who feels any kind of affinity for rural, or is curious, or spent their summers with their grandparents, or we all have some connection, even if we can't completely name it, to rural places and rural culture. So, in a way, I think there's a point to be had there. Let's see. I'd like to do one more question if I could, and then I'd like to ask you to read something for us. This is from my friend Chris. He says, I saved this morsel from your book about your journey as a writer. It took a lot of nerve for someone so ignorant of true wilderness to fashion herself as a nature writer. But the flip side of ignorance is astonishment, and I'm good at astonishment. And then he goes on to say, it struck me as a perfect description of your writing, but it also made me wonder if this is advice that you would share with others. Would you coach other writers, everyone, to let themselves be astonished?
It's funny. I think that that's one of the best things about being human. I mean, it's kind of the foundation of all humor, for example, is to be startled by something, to be caught off guard by something you expect and have something completely different be the way the joke ends, or whatever. And I think that I'm reluctant to give prescriptions for other writers, because I do believe that the best way to be a writer is to find what it is that you love and are curious about and want to know more about. I think maybe when I was younger, I believed that writers write what they know. And that's certainly advice that people in writing programs are, write what you know. But I'm not that interested in what I know. I'm a lot more interested in what I need to know and what I need to learn, and how to, and if it's something like that, um, like it is just what I wrote about this week was how anybody can become a naturalist. You don't have to have a degree in ornithology or entomology to be really just delighted by this grasshopper that flies up and lands in your flower bed while you're weeding. It's just a matter of being open to it. And so I do think the capacity for astonishment is one path toward finding your subject as a writer, or subjects.
Would you mind closing us out with one of your essays? And I'm going to name it for everyone. I got to pick it because I'm in charge here. Be a weed is what I requested. And that would be a lovely closing for us.
Be a weed. Sometimes when I haven't slept, or the news of the world, already bad, suddenly becomes much worse. The weight of belonging here is a heaviness I can't shake. But then I think of the glister of a particular morning in springtime. I think of standing in the sunshine and watering the butterfly garden, which is mostly cultivated weeds punctuated by the uncultivated kind that come back despite my pinching and tugging. I think of the caterpillars on the milkweed plants, unperturbed by the overspray, and the resident red-tailed hawk gliding overhead, chased by a mockingbird and 3 angry crows, and the bluebird standing on top of the nest box, protecting his mate, who is inside laying an egg. I think of that morning, not even a morning, not even an hour, and I say to myself, be an egg, be a mockingbird, be a weed.
Thank you so much for that, for this conversation, for sharing your gift with the world through this book, through your columns, and I want to tell everyone that your forthcoming book is called Graceland at Last. And I think it's a collection of New York Times essays, correct?
It is.
Hey.
All of, not every
Good.
write about the for the Times is strictly about the South, but this one is. Everyone in there is trying to present a more complicated version of the South.
That's wonderful. So these books can be purchased at Parnassus Books in Nashville. You can go online and order them there. It's an independent bookstore that we would want to lift up here. And then also follow Margaret on in the New York Times. I think your column comes out on Mondays these days. Yes.
Mostly. Sometimes
Okay.
Sunday night, depending, but mostly on Monday morning, yes. And thank you so much for reading, Whitney, and thank you for inviting me to join this amazing event you've put together. It's so important, I think, for our country to hear these voices and for everybody to hear each other as well.
Thank you for saying that. It is so good to have you here and to meet you finally. So I'm going to hang on here, and I want to let people know that I hope you'll stick around for what's coming next. We've got some incredible musicians and more stories. White House Domestic Policy Council Director Susan Rice will address us around 3 o'clock. And then that will be followed by a roundtable discussion about disinformation in rural America, which you don't want to miss. So stay online. And thank you, Margaret.
Thanks, Whitney. Thanks, everybody.
Hi, I'm Shuli Kaywood, and I'm going to be reading today from my new book, Trouble Can Be So Beautiful at the Beginning, published by Mercer University Press in February of 2021. I'm going to be reading a poem called On Sundays. So many years it took to master those Sunday lessons taught in my tia's tiny kitchen. Not the way to break open the bellies of bolillo and spread butter and beans onto bread. Not how to make caldo with chicken bones and calabacita and cebolla we had selected and weighed with a cast iron scale at the little garage market blocks away. What I'm telling you is, on those Sundays, when my primas gathered in my tia's kitchen, while their husbands and children kicked soccer balls outside the screen door, when Laline stirred whatever soup steamed on the stove, when Fandro dunked her whole arms into the sink and scrubbed knives and pans and cutting boards, when Ati squeezed thin-skinned limones and let the juice run free into my tia's old aluminum pot while I scraped the papaya clean of black seeds, I often wondered why the women got stuck with all that Sunday work. Oh, so many things I did not know. In my tia's crowded kitchen, my primas talked with and over each other so that you had to have pluck to finish a sentence before it drifted into the next. Their words mingled and their voices and laughter rose and fell, but mostly rose like the swirl of incense, like a kind of fervent prayer that came to me only years later in my own place of sanctitude, where no one could tell me whatsoever the things that I should do.
I started drawing comics in my late 20s in response to personal grief. I was just getting into comics around the time that a friend of mine died, and it felt like a really great way for me to be able to tell these like little moments and true stories. I got really attracted to nonfiction comics from the beginning, biographical comics. The more that as an activist and as an artist I continued down both paths, the more it became obvious that I needed to combine both of them. And now what I do is I work for our local newspaper as an editorial cartoonist, telling small portions of true stories that help further conversations. Anything that specifically impacts rural people in our area that deserves to have more of a conversation, I bring up the controversy in 3 panels to get that conversation started. And I've been really lucky. There's been a lot of change in the newspaper in the year and a half that I've been there, and it's just been very cool that they have continued to support me, even though I'm often the most radical thing in the paper. But for people like me who are getting their start in comics, I feel like there's so many small papers that could really benefit from this, giving these voices and giving this possibility. And the Leader is an independent newspaper, and it's I think it's like over 100 years old. It's like an old newspaper, and it's really cool that they've stayed independent and they're willing to do this, and I think it's a possibility for more places. It's really nice to be able to break things down simply, to be able to take 2 hours worth of dialogue and bring it down into 3 panels. I know that I'm going to be able to come up with something that anybody's going to be able to understand within 20 to 30 seconds. At least if they don't understand the problem, they should understand why they should care about it. Honestly, I start out with like a wall of mind mapping and have to kind of like whittle it down into being, somebody brilliantly said that you can get into a comic like this as much text as you can put on a sticky note. So it's like, okay, I'm gonna take this gigantic like A2 sketchbook and turn it into a sticky note, and then by the time I've gotten to that, I know what the story is and I know what the image is. I try and mix things up. I try and tell a story that's like, here's something that feels really urgent and here's something that like you should know, and then occasionally there's comics about just what it's like in a pandemic being stuck with your cat 24/7. I know I have friends on city council, and I know that they've received phone calls saying, hey, I saw in the Nada Tech comic this week, she said this, this, and this, is that true? The fact that they're calling their city councilors or their county commissioners and saying, is this going on, is like the highest compliment. It means that I'm doing my job. You know, I'm getting people interested in a way that says, I want more answers. I think the thing that makes me the most happy is being able to work with news sources that don't work with comics. I just want to be able to reach people who aren't expecting me. I just really want to see that transition be made to where comics are just a natural part of the news community.
Everyone, my name is Joy Priest, and me and my neighbor Robert Geip are going to tell you some stories. Quilting frames. Quilting frames was what they called Charlie's mule because its bones were like a rack its skin hung over. The mule had more sense than he did, taking his drunk ass home every day, my grandmother says on the phone from Cleveland, a long way from Alabama now. She says, when they'd been sewing for a while and the quilt had grown heavy as an animal's coat, they would throw it over a wooden frame to keep it upright. Says she and the other women would sit on the porch same time every evening to see Charlie ride by on his way in from town, Lansville, where he'd go like all the other men after 13 hours in the field. He'd be stone drunk and thrown over the back of that damn mule, she says, which knew its way home and how to hold up a worked thing.
I'm Robert Geip. I'm going to read out of my novel, Pop. This is from chapter 52. A woman named Nicolette's having a vision. I said, Mama Remedy, your medicine made a flood. And Mama Remedy said, baby, flap your arms. And I did. And I lifted off the owl's back and took on the wobbly flight of a woodpecker. Devils flew beside us. Devils and mockingbirds and spaceships. Little birds gossiped in my ear. The flood remedy drained away. The people helped each other clean up. We flew above them, not helping at all. I said, Mama Remedy, we should help. And Mama Remedy showed me her hands, both full of blackberries. She wished them into jam, wished the jam onto biscuits, pitched biscuits to me, flying through the air. Rained blackberry biscuits down on the coal camps and hollers, basketfuls for the granny women, midwives, and nurse practitioners and physician's assistants that walked the creeks below us. The remedy receded and the hollers dried out and pistols fired and knives cut meat. And we flew in and out of good women's kitchen windows. One was fixing molasses candy. One wiped a baby's butt with a hoe cake and threw the hoe cake to a dog. We flew in and out of morning glories, festooning in women's porches. We flew through beans strung on the line in their gardens. Uncle Galax grew small as a June bug, buzzed the chickens who chased him through their yards. We flew through honky-tonks full of electric guitars and electric blondes, cowboy boots, and mullets. We glanced past liquor lit pink and purple, past strings of LED lights, past neon beer light signs. We flew through fluorescent churches full of people with their hands raised to Jesus, speaking in tongues, hair piled high, hair falling loose, snakes shooting out their hands into the air to wrap around our legs and waists and fly with us. The snakes flew with us till we come to a burned over woods hot in the sun. The snakes snaked to the ground, zipped in hollow logs, slithered in between layers of rock. Kudzu grew fast as deer, running beneath us. The roof peeled off a skating rink deep in the woods. Boy with a mullet skated figures chased waterfalls. People in tank tops and short shorts did mudhole donuts and monstrous pickups, ran through the puddles on their dirt bikes, jumped lines of washing machines on souped up four-wheelers, beer cans flying everywhere, videos posted all over Facebook. And Aunt Remedy waved me back onto my owl, and I settled on the owl's back. And me and Joy will be back tomorrow to swap some more stories with you.
We are really, really thrilled to be in the midst of this beautiful, beautiful place on a beautiful, beautiful day. So we're going to start out with a song that we wrote about the biodiversity of the shortgrass prairie, which is where we live. And I have to say, I don't know that there's a lot of folk songs dedicated to biodiversity, but
Maybe we'll start a trend. This song is called Follow Me. Follow me, follow me, follow me to the wild prairie, western wheat, needle leaf, plains mullein, sand lily, thread leaf sedge, tall blue stem. Follow me, follow me. Barred sparrow, meadowlark, Swainson's hawk, sandpiper, sagebrush vote, prairie dog, stand up tall, stand up tall. Oh, follow me, follow me, oh, follow me to the wild prairie. Oh, longhorn elk, silver leaf, prickly pear, watch out there. Oh, follow me, follow me, follow me to the wild prairie.
Hi, friends. We're so glad you're with us here at Rural Assembly Everywhere. We're halfway through our main stage programming on this first day. We've appreciated the poetry of Nikki Finney, the reflections of writer Margaret Wrinkle, and all those videos delivered to us from rural artists, advocates, and rock stars from across the country. We've got more great content coming your way this hour. And kicking us off, I'm so pleased to welcome Susan Rice to the Everywhere stage. Ms. Rice is the director of the White House Domestic Policy Council and former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. As a senior level member of the Biden administration, Ms. Rice is focused on developing and implementing a policy agenda that brings greater dignity, equity, opportunity, and prosperity to the everyday lives of all Americans. We've asked her to speak today to how rural and Native communities are part of that equity agenda and how the American Rescue Plan gets us closer to a more just and prosperous future. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Susan Rice.
Thank you to Rural Assembly for this invitation to a gathering that spans every corner of the country. It's an honor to join a lineup of rural leaders advocates, farmers, workers, artists, and storytellers that showcases the incredible diversity of rural communities and serves as a reminder that rural America is truly everywhere. Rural America is in the food we eat and the landscapes we cherish, in the stories of Native people, immigrants, and descendants of slaves. It's in our rivers, roads, and rails, and the movement of people and goods that drive our economy. And just as rural America has been a vital piece of our past, you will help lead us into a more sustainable, equitable, and prosperous future. From energy production and climate change to innovations in mobility, manufacturing, and agriculture, rural America is at the forefront of so many challenges and opportunities that we face as a nation. Rural communities are a high priority for the Biden administration. First, we're committed to ensuring COVID-19 vaccines get to rural areas. And as we begin to turn the page from crisis to recovery, we're investing in areas of critical need, such as healthcare, substance use prevention, schools, and housing. But we must also look beyond the pandemic. We must build back better than before. The road to that more prosperous future runs through rural America, and the Biden administration stands ready to ensure we all reach it. At the very heart of that promise is a commitment to equity and inclusivity, and I know that Rural Assembly shares those values. The pandemic has painfully exposed the costs of inequity, as marginalized communities across America have borne the heaviest burdens. But this is not some new reality. Indian country has long suffered with a lack of healthcare access and inadequate funding. In Appalachia, miners who risk their lives to power our economy have seen wealth extracted from the ground, leaving nothing but a scarred landscape behind. Today, rural America is home to more than 8 in 10 persistent poverty counties. These inequities span generations and require a generational investment. That's why the equity agenda is not only a question of policy, it's the bedrock on which we will build a government that serves all people. Equity boosts our economy, our towns, our very democracy. It's the opportunity for every child to realize the promise of America, from the Smoky Mountains to the Cascades. On day one, President Biden signed an executive order to embed equity across every federal agency and ensure resources are not only reaching all communities, but also meeting their needs. For rural America, that means support for planning and capacity building at the local and regional level, so that small communities have the resources they need to access federal programs. That means flexible funding, so that every community can build on its own unique assets and ambitions. These principles are not just hopes and dreams. They're concrete actions woven through the American Rescue Plan and the American Jobs Plan. The President understands that rural communities have missed out on economic growth and government investment for years, and he is determined to change that reality. The American Jobs Plan will transform how the federal government supports rural communities. The plan's proposed Rural Partnership Program provides $5 billion in dedicated flexible funding to rural and tribal areas for locally led community and economic development. The program is designed to meet the needs of communities on the ground for planning, technical assistance, and implementation, so that rural America is leading its own way into the future. Rural communities are racially, economically, and culturally diverse. There's no such thing as one size fits all. Whether you want to build around outdoor recreation, manufacturing, agriculture, or cultural heritage, it's time to reimagine an inclusive rural economy where the strengths of each community are reinforced and celebrated. The Rural Partnership Program is just one way we will address historic underinvestment in rural communities. The American Jobs Plan calls for upgrading rural infrastructure and bringing safe drinking water to every American. It invests in rural housing so that low-income homeowners and renters can secure a stable home. And it commits $100 billion to ensure universal access to high-speed, affordable broadband. These efforts build on the American Rescue Plan's investments in education, healthcare, and nutrition that are already helping rural families and workers get back on their feet. The American Rescue Plan also recognizes that not everyone has equal access to the opportunities of rural America. My great-grandfather, Pratt Suber, was a slave in South Carolina, who after the Civil War managed to secure a piece of land. Though modest, he had the foothold he needed to become a successful farmer and a local leader, despite the cards being stacked against him in the Reconstruction South. The legacy of that land meant that 2 generations later, my father, Emmett Rice, was born into a family with just enough stability to allow him to dream what he could be. Although he grew up in the heart of Jim Crow, my father served his country during World War II with the Tuskegee Airmen, and he overcame the barriers of segregation to ultimately sit on the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. There's a clear link between my great-grandfather's plot of farmland and where I am today. But too many Black, Native, and other farmers of color are denied the opportunity to build wealth that can grow over generations. That's why the American Rescue Plan included $5 billion for assistance and debt relief for socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. That's why it included $31 billion for tribal governments, education, housing, and health care, the largest ever federal investment in our Native communities. These actions are long overdue, targeting some of the most enduring inequities in rural America. We still have a long way to go, but this is a historic start. While we work to correct past wrongs, we must also look to the future. The American Jobs Plan positions rural communities to lead the clean energy transition through partnerships with rural electric co-ops to replace old power plants with renewable systems. It creates 250,000 jobs, cleaning up abandoned wells and mines, and doubles funding for economic development in coal country so that no community is left behind. And it will make U.S. agriculture the global standard in net zero emissions, protecting the environment while opening new markets for our farmers. President Biden and Vice President Harris are committed to expanding rural prosperity through investments that respond to the crises of today and lay the groundwork for a stronger tomorrow. Rural communities can lead the nation out of crisis into a new era of inclusive growth, but we need your support to pass the American Jobs Plan and turn this vision we share into reality. Together, let's build a more equitable society where rural communities remain thriving places to live, work, and raise a family for generations to come. Thank you.
When I see just how horribly divided and polarized the country is, and how much misinformation there is that is leading to this division, it just makes me more convinced than ever that a key part of the solution is rebuilding local news. Local news is collapsing. Communities are becoming news deserts, and in the absence of trusted local news sources, people are flooded with misinformation. Even before COVID-19, the number of reporters had declined 60% since 2000. During the pandemic, some 36,000 newspaper employees have been laid off, furloughed, or had their pay cut, and 50 local news outlets have been permanently closed. And the problem is about to get worse. The vacuum in local news is being replaced by thousands of partisan websites or disinformation websites. The decline in local press leads to more polarization. The void is being filled with national news, and we view each other as political stereotypes instead of neighbors with potentially common interests. Report for America is a national service program that places talented emerging journalists into local newsrooms to report on undercovered communities and topics like education, criminal justice, public health, racial equity, and local government.
Educators recognize that kids who fell off from attending virtual classes are at a great disadvantage for the upcoming school year.
Our core members are full-time employees of the news organizations they're matched with. That could be daily newspapers, public radio stations, nonprofit websites, public TV, weekly newspapers. And they receive training and mentorship and networking opportunities. These are reporters living in those communities, not just parachuting in, becoming part of the neighborhood and being known and seen by the residents there and covering the issues that are really important to people in those communities. All core members are also required to lead a media-related community service project, often working in middle schools and high schools. Report for America will revive the idea that local reporting is a public service.
So we started getting these warnings on the back of our water bill.
Do you know anybody who drinks the water?
No.
Nobody?
Nobody.
We will place over 2,500 talented emerging journalists in over 750 local newsrooms nationwide, virtually eliminating America's biggest news deserts by producing hundreds of thousands of stories for those communities each year. We'll field about 1,000 journalists of color in America's newsrooms in 6 years, a dramatic accomplishment and change in the nature of local journalism, and advance other forms of diversity, creating a seismic shift in representation in newsrooms. The core members will lead thousands of service projects with high school and middle school students. They will guide some 50,000 young people in creating their own journalism and media.
How is information used and abused in small communities? What do we know about the disinformation campaigns influencing the opinions of our neighbors, family members, and friends? And what can we learn about the role of disinformation in the 2020 election and the January 6th riots at the US Capitol? Well, let's meet the folks who will be part of the conversation today. And I ask that you briefly tell us a bit more. So in 2 minutes or less, how did you come to the work that you're actually doing? So first we have Patrice O'Neill, a filmmaker and CEO of the Oakland-based nonprofit strategic media company, The Working Group, and the leader of Not in Our Town. Her film, Not in Our Town, began as a half-hour PBS special and turned into a dynamic movement to stop hate and build inclusion in communities across the US and around the world. Patrice.
Hi, AB and panel. I'm so grateful to learn from my fellow panelists and from the amazing group of leaders that Dee Davis has helped to assemble over these many years. For me, 25 years of engagement with communities across the country in the fight against hate, I've seen over and over again that there are vital solutions and untapped potential emerging from local communities that can help us overcome some of the deepest challenges facing our country. So I look forward to learning from the people in this gathering. We need you now. And if you watch the news, the threat is apparent. The FBI reported 51 hate crime murders in 2019, the largest number since they started aggregating hate crime data in the early 90s. 23 of those lives were lost at a Walmart in El Paso. But it goes beyond the killings. I've heard from my Asian friends who've been spat upon, called coronavirus, and who are worried about their parents and grandparents walking to the store. So as a way to introduce myself, because I know this is part of solutions. How do we overcome these conspiracy theories and misinformation of calling coronavirus the China virus? How do we address it? I'm going to tell you just briefly a story about Not in Our Town and where it came from. It emerged from a story we did about people in Billings, Montana, who were standing up to hate. There was an organizing drive of white supremacists in the Northwest, and they wanted to declare Billings to be their homeland. And people there knew that they had to do something, or more and more people were going to be attacked. So when skinheads started showing up at a very small African-American church in town, members of other denominations were there to support the congregations and the congregation, and the skinheads went away. When a Native American woman's home was plastered with racist graffiti, 30 members of the painters union showed up to paint it over, and 100 neighbors were there to watch. So the town started learning there are things we can do together. The culminating event in the story took place when a 6-year-old Jewish boy placed a menorah in his window for Hanukkah. A brick was thrown through the window, it landed on his bed, and people knew that this was getting more dangerous. So they said, what if we're all Jewish? And so they started making these paper menorahs, passing them out at the dry cleaners in the quick way, putting them in their windows. The local newspaper printed a full-page menorah, urging people to put it in their windows. And that year, 10,000 people put menorahs in their windows in Billings, Montana. And there are not 10,000 Jewish people in Billings. It was an end to the white supremacist terror in that town. Hate and violence didn't go away for sure, but it worked. And that kind of community action, that civic action, understanding what each of us can do, led to a movement that people started identifying with after they saw our film. And I think it is that impetus that of a community to see what they can do together is what I'd like to talk about as we get to solutions to this deep problem of disinformation and hate speech.
Okay, Patrice, thank you. And our next panelist, Laura Quinn, was a founder and currently serves as president of Catalyst, and that's List with an I, Catalyst LLC, which is owned by a not-for-profit trust and provides comprehensive voter data and related data services exclusively to progressive civic organizations. And Laura, you actually collaborated with a group of philanthropists in 2019, correct?
Yeah, that's right. They were mounting a big effort to push back against disinformation. They had done a prototype project in Europe right ahead of their EU parliamentary elections in 2019 and had some success. So they actually then got together amongst themselves and then supported a federation of organizations that were doing work to push back against disinformation. And you ask how I came to this. I've spent a good part of the last decade and a half, two decades almost, looking at data about the civic life of primarily the US and how voters are behaving, which way they're voting, what issues are they're engaging on, all kinds of data about voters. And we have been watching over the last 2 decades more and more polarization in the country. But it accelerated pretty dramatically in the last 5 years. And the extreme sort of points of view that were coming through in a lot of the data that we were examining, and the voters' voting behavior really shifted pretty dramatically in 2016. It took a lurch. Usually things in the civic space move pretty gradually, but these kinds of moves in the behavior of voters were pretty surprising and shocking. So we did what we always do. We looked at the data to try to correlate it with what might be causing voters to really move in such dramatic ways. So we looked at all the things that we love to collect data about, like income level and race and ethnicity, and whether jobs were moving into your county or moving out of your county, or whether robots were replacing people around you, whether there's more immigrants or less immigrants, all the kinds of demographic and socioeconomic data to try to explain why were people shifting around so much and why was there so much more extremism. And the thing that really got me very much engaged in this particular issue is when we started to look at something where we hadn't been collecting data, which was what is your source of information? That really, I mean, some of the economic stresses were they were giving us a pretty good explanation. Some of the other racial resentment issues were giving part of the explanation. But when we started to look at where people were getting their information from, there was really new strong correlations. Now, I wish we had the data going back in time, but part of the reason why we weren't collecting that kind of data is, frankly, everyone was getting their information from one large information ecosystem that was all connected. Everyone was sort of seeing a lot of the same news. They were getting a lot of the same reports. And now we are, in the last 10 years, we have moved into a different kind of information arena, where we have different information bubbles that people are inside of, and they're not seeing the same set of information. And that is going a long way to explain a lot of the extremism. And the mechanics of that whole system is having a bigger effect on people than we think. And to tell you the truth, I actually felt a little bit relieved when I started to see that data, because it really makes you recognize that this isn't all coming from a purely organic place. You know, that these are not just merely latent, serious problems that this country has to address, which is clear, but it is also being artificially amplified and stoked in ways that are very destructive to social cohesion and destructive to being able to do the work as a society that we all know that we need to do. And that's why I'm heads down on this you know, until we get done what needs to get done.
I think you're on mute, Evie.
Here we go again. Thank you very much. And Hari Hahn is the inaugural director of the SNF Agora Institute. That's the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Professor of Political Science and faculty director of the P3 Research Lab at Johns Hopkins University. And Hari, you specialize in the study of organizing movements, civic engagement, and democracy.
Right, yeah, thank you. First of all, just let me also echo Patrice and say I'm so happy to be a part of this panel and delighted to be in conversation with you all. I'm grateful for the opportunity for what I'm sure will be a fruitful 45 minutes together. Yeah, so I wear a couple different hats. I direct an institute called the SNF Agora Institute that's dedicated to strengthening democracy all over the world, with a particular focus on the notion of the Agora as being fundamental to making democracy work. And, you know, the Agora are the kind of places where people come together in their communities, whether they're digital or in-person communities, and gather with each other to figure out how they can create the world that we want. And I think that historically, we've always known that that's fundamental to making democracy work, but one of the trends that we've seen in recent years is that those agora-like spaces have become hollowed or emaciated in the ways that Patrice and Laura have already described to us. The information ecosystem is fundamentally a part of that agora, that civic space and that interstitial space where people come together, but there are also other parts of it too that I think hint at some of the kinds of solutions that we can point to. And in terms of how I got into this work, I grew up as a daughter of Korean immigrants in Texas, and I was born in the United States, but my parents had immigrated after they were, you know, in their adulthood. And I think a lot of what I saw growing up was my parents trying to figure out what it meant to raise a family in the U.S., like how they could make it, quote unquote, in the U.S., whatever that meant. And I think that kind of imbued with me this sense that part of what's so important to all of us as humans is this question of how do we become architects of our own future. And I think that's fundamentally what these kind of civic spaces that that democracy really is about, is this question of how do we bring together people of all different kinds and figure out how they can all put their hands on the levers of change and trying to sort of make a better life for themselves. And so that's a lot of the work that we do at the Agora Institute and also my own research lab.
Okay, great. Patrice, Laura, and Hari, thank you. And so, disinformation in rural America, is it somehow different than disinformation elsewhere? And Laura, I'll toss that to you first.
Well, the information diet that is predominant in large metropolitan areas and the one that is predominant in the rural parts of the country have become increasingly different and untethered from each other. You used to have, sorry, let me get rid of that. You used to have an information system that was really very well connected. You had, large wire services, you had national networks that were feeding local affiliates, you had local affiliates that were doing news gathering of their own and passing it back up that food chain. So you had a lot of cross-pollinization. And that has really, broken down for a whole variety of reasons. The economic system that supported local newspapers has collapsed. The local television stations have vastly disinvested in gathering news. So they're relying more and more on packaged up news that come from national outlets, whether that be national networks like CBS or from cable news networks, or they're actually, the local stations are now taking news feeds from national newsrooms for the Sinclair broadcasting system and then the Nexstar broadcasting system. So the news gathering in local places is not happening. And what that is causing is the impression that urban dwellers have about rural America is really not very accurate. The interesting thing that the data tells you is that when you ask urban people about rural America, they think it's in terrible shape. They think there's a meth epidemic, which is a serious problem in rural America, but their impression of how that is destroying communities is perhaps outsized to the reality. And the belief that there aren't healthy rural communities anywhere isn't kind of almost an urban myth. You have a similar phenomenon in rural America, where the impression that rural Americans often have about urban America is that everything is on fire and there's nothing but violence. So the impression in both directions is being warped by the fact that news gathering is not locally owned anymore and is not being locally produced and isn't rich and really high quality. So that in and of itself is creating sort of two different ecosystems. It is also true that from a partisan point of view, the news ownership in rural America is much more in the ownership hands of companies that have taken a much harder conservative or hard right conservative point of view. That started with talk radio, and it's really now spilled over into local TV affiliates. And as I say, print is largely disappearing. While you might say that in urban metropolitan spaces, there's a much, much more liberal point of view, a much more progressive point of view. So you have those megaphones, those news instruments no longer giving you a blend of both. Each part of the country is getting a more and more kind of customized narratives suited to reinforce what they may already believe, but maybe even not just what they already believe, but that are also promoting a particular point of view and causing it to be more deeply adopted in both of those places.
Right. And that's actually a very interesting point about, the relationship between disinformation in rural America and misinformation about rural America. And Hari, when we were speaking offline, you referred to this disinformation as a crisis. Could you tell us a little bit more? Why is it a crisis, and why should we be so concerned?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because on the one hand, we could sort of say, if we look back in American history and our political history, that we've always had disinformation, right? The yellow journalism has been a thing from the very earliest days of journalism, as they say, and that, you know, we've seen actually really vitriolic things that political candidates, that political parties, you know, all these things that we'll say about each other, and that's not unchanged. I think what is different, I think there are two reasons why I think that, actually maybe three reasons that I think that it's particular now. So one is what Laura already talked about, just the sort of fragmentation of the information ecosystem is different now than what we've seen in the past. And so the locating the sources of the disinformation is a much bigger challenge now than it used to be. Second, it's the speed and scale with which information is moving nowadays. And so we've always had disinformation, right? But when yellow journalism used to spread in the early 1900s, let's say, it wasn't moving at the speed and scale right now, where right now what you have is a situation where a piece of disinformation goes out into the public sphere, and then people react to it and then make decisions based on it in real time, even as it's spreading throughout different networks. So the speed and the scale, I think, make it different. And then the third thing I would say is something that is a little bit different, which is sort of this question of what makes people so susceptible to disinformation right now? You know, in my like nerdy academic terms, I would sort of say like, what's the kind of political economy of disinformation? Like, what makes it work? And there's a lot of research that shows that, you know, people are more susceptible to disinformation when they feel more powerless, right? Because what the disinformation does often is that it helps people develop explanations for why they feel unhappy about their current circumstances, whatever those circumstances might be. And so there's this question of also, as we see kind of rising rates of inequality and a decline of social cohesion and like all these other kind of ills that are afflicting our society, that people are more susceptible to disinformation in a way that is less likely in a society that has more equity across it. And so I think that there are sort of several dimensions to the reason why I think this is a sort of different crisis than maybe one that we've had in the past. And just to kind of like your last point, why is it a crisis? Well, democracy is fundamentally about people coming together to solve public problems. And if people can't even agree on basic facts, it makes it very hard for us to develop the kind of the social cohesion, the kind of commitment to a common good, the sort of motivations that we need to do the hard work of trying to work together across to solve these kind of problems.
And Hari, when you talk about the speed and scale, there also isn't that filter. I mean, people are getting, and this speaks to what Laura was talking about as well. People are just getting this raw information, and before, when people were relying on the wire services like Reuters and UPI and AP, there was a little bit of a filter. So that's really very concerning when we've actually lost that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a way in which like there are no more referees, in the system, and but if you think about like almost every sport or game that we have, or kind of like system in which people kind of have to cooperate with each other in different ways, you have to have some referees every now and then, and we've sort of lost that, and we certainly don't have trust in a shared set of referees, and so I think that's that's an important reason why within this unfiltered marketplace, it not only makes it easier for those ideas to kind of spread, but also the quality of the ideas is challenging.
And I think there's one more factor to throw on top of this, which probably leads right into what Patrice was talking about, which is the consequences. So not only has the information system been sort of breaking in two, where you have urban America getting one version of what's going on and rural America getting another version, but on top of that, the information is now being distributed basically through two railway systems, Facebook and Google. So whether you're looking at the New York Times or you're looking at Breitbart or you're looking at anything in between, very often it's being distributed to the largest part of the audience through one of those two rail systems. And those rail systems are not giving a blend. They're not doing what old network television used to do, which is like show you a bit of everything. They are in fact doing something very, very different. They want to hold your attention, and attention they know from watching how you behave, and they are watching all of us every minute of the day that we're online. They know that attention is best grabbed by showing you things that are extreme and sensational. So they have a hand on the knobs here. They are turning up the extremism that's on the edges of our society and pulling it in and putting it front and center. And if you start to lose attention, they will go out and grab something even more sensational and put it in front of you. So that is a new, like, it's not just that you don't have a referee, you don't have firemen helping put out the fires. You have folks with flamethrowers trying to light up the fires. And that is another part of the problem that we don't have to have. And pushing back against some of that extremism, I think, is what Patrice was talking about, which is the best way to combat that extremism is not to rebut it, it's to push more positive information in front of folks. And the best way for that to happen right now is, as Patrice was describing, engaged communities recognizing that the extremism that they're seeing is not organic and that they do have agency to push back against it. One of the things that's also true in the social media space is, believe it or not, individuals prefer to share happier news. The algorithms prefer to share sensational and extreme news. So that is part of the understanding of the way the new information system works that needs to be better understood by the public, because they are being acted upon and they are losing their ability to, act themselves. And I don't know if Patrice that.
But you know what? I actually before we go to Patrice and solutions, you brought up social media, and I was going to save this for later, but I want to read this now and get your thoughts on this. And this is an editorial written by Wyatt Emmerich, and he is the president and CEO of Emmerich Newspapers, which operates nearly 25 newspapers in Mississippi. And I read this in the Wayne County News in Waynesboro, Mississippi, which I call my hometown newspaper since I used to spend my summers there. But he wrote an editorial very, very critical of Donald Trump and his actions as they related to the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And so Emmerich writes, Congress was attacked by the monster it created 25 years ago in 1996 when it passed Section 230 of the Communications Act. That act gave internet companies legal immunity from anything they published on their social media platforms. It was one of the worst decisions in the history of Congress. Every publisher in the history of publishing has been legally liable for what they published. My company is liable for the contents of every ad, every article, every letter to the editor. It should be. Congress ignored 500 years of libel and slander, common law, and exempted internet publishers, sowing the seeds of the social division we see today. And the rabble attacking Congress had visions of global conspiracy theories dancing in their heads, conspiracies posted by fakes and charlatans posting as legitimate journalists. Your reaction, and Laura, we'll start with you.
Well, I think I agree with the publisher from Mississippi. Facebook, Google, these information systems are products, and products that cause harms are usually forced to remedy them and install safety features and safeguards. They're required to raise standards. And the fact that the social media platforms have gotten a complete pass at this point, I think is, ridiculous and needs correction. And I don't think that everyone in the public is always completely aware of how Wild West it is, on Facebook, inside of these Facebook groups. But just to give you the most basic kinds of examples, you can't commit fraud and sell medicines that hurt people through the mail. You can't sell guns on television. you can't collect information about children as they're watching television and sell it to other people so that they can market to them or do worse. And all of those things and so many more, sale of babies, endangered species, you name it, it's happening on Facebook right now with very little oversight, no transparency, and being managed by a set of executives that have not demonstrated any responsibility for what their products are causing, both in this country and in even worse ways, around the world. So I think I am wholeheartedly in favor of new standards, higher quality, and more safeguards for the public for this product, just like any other product.
Ari, new standards, are they needed?
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with what Laura said. And I think the kind of bigger point that both in the editorial that you read and also what Laura was describing to us is the fact that the construction of the information ecosystem that we have is a series of choices that people have made over time. It's a series of choices that executives at the tech companies made, a series of choices that government has made and how they're going to interact with the tech companies. And so it doesn't have to be so, right, is the point. And that I think part of the challenge then is how do we begin to help people understand that there's a series of choices that are inflaming the kind of information that we're receiving, the kind of society that we're creating together, and then think about what is that actually the design of the information ecosystem that we want. And I think most of us would say, no, it's actually not what we really want. And the question is, how do we reclaim and find, design a different kind of information ecosystem that works for the people and not just for the railways, as Laura was saying.
Okay, so solutions that work in fighting the disinformation campaign. Patrice, when we spoke, you said, trying to go troll to troll just don't work. That it just won't work. That's a failed strategy. What do you mean?
Well, I think you have to look at you have to face what's happening and the things that I think everyone here is describing. There are very specific pieces of information and this toxic stew of both dangerous speech and conspiracy theories that are living online. And they need to be exposed, right? They need to reach the light of day so that in our real world, in our real lives, we can fight them together. I'm working on a film now about Pittsburgh in the aftermath of the attack at Tree of Life Synagogue, where 11 people were murdered. And the conspiracy theory that we started, that men walking down the street in Charlottesville started to vocalize, Jews will not replace us, helped drive this man, according to his social media posts, to go and murder 11 Jewish people. And he chose that synagogue because of their support for immigrants and refugees, right? And so this idea that Jewish people are trying to replace white Europeans with people of color and immigrants is a really dangerous conspiracy theory that needs to be, I think we need to understand it so that we can fight it in the real world, so that we can give our young people, our community members, the tools to understand just how ridiculous it is, but how deeply harmful. And to really understand, Susan Benish, if you haven't seen her site, she runs a project called the Dangerous Speech Project, trying to identify the level of speech that has led to mass murder in the past. And it's particularly when we dehumanize people, when we dehumanize each other, when we call each other insects, make that comparison, that speech becomes particularly dangerous. And then there is this effort which I think we've seen in the Capitol riots, which is to say, the enemy before us is so much unlike us that they are not really the same level of human that we are. And so I think we have to face those things and get that out in the open in order to understand the threat that we're facing, and to realize what our young people are seeing when they go into gaming sites, right? To see the level of recruitment and not just misinformation, but really harmful speech that children are being exposed to under the guise of jokes. Do you want to come into a joke site, right?
Jokes and memes and things like that. And Patrice, you talked about providing people with the tools that they need, and it kind of relates to a question from a viewer. Asking, how do we hold companies and politicians and their campaigns and news organizations accountable? And that speaks to this idea of what tools do we actually need? That's probably part of it. And Hari, I saw you nodding your head. What sort of tools are available to people to get a better understanding of what disinformation is?
Well, so I think, I think that probably a lot of the work that Patrice is describing that she's doing is the kind of thing that we've seen be most effective. So just to kind of reinforce what Patrice said at the very beginning, one of the worst things you can do to combat disinformation is to throw more information, at people and try to convince them with the sort of power of your facts and logic that you're right, and instead, it's about sort of embedding people in a set of social networks or trusted social networks where people who they trust kind of reclaim together both the information that they're receiving and how they interpret and make sense of the information that they see. And I think that so the solutions and the tools that people have are really right there before us, right? It's about what are the ways in which we are connecting with each other? What are the kind of settings in which we invite people to come and try to interact with each other across the kind of lines of difference that we're increasingly seeing more, less and less of. And, I think that, sometimes when people think about, solutions to disinformation at the level of communities, so everyone wants to have like one tool that we can use across like a magic bullet that we can find. And I think the magic bullet is not there because it has to be tailored to the specific circumstances of a community. And so what, people that grew up in rural Texas, that I knew when I was growing up are going to need something different than what people in Baltimore, Maryland need, which is where I live now. And I think that we should look for that magic bullet. But instead, the kind of question is like, how do we identify the people that can be like the kindling that light the fire? Like who are the people in communities across America who are like that kindling? And then how do we light the match that sets that kindling on fire, which then they heat up the log to sort of set the bigger log on fire? I think those are the kind of questions that we need to be asking. And then also I should just say, and that is alongside also regulating the big companies and stuff like that too. So I think there's both a bottom up and a top down solution that we need to do in parallel to each other.
Somewhere we meet in the middle. Well, that leads to another viewer question. I live in a very rural area of the Arkansas Ozarks. Our local news has been effectively shut down, and as a small percentage of the information we use what we used to have available. My question is, how do we not only report on local issues, but raise our voices loud enough to be heard among the noise? How can local news be sure to reach the local audience? Laura, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think, the macro changes are helping the public understand that the version of information that they're seeing through social media is distorted. Like fundamentally, when you're looking in the rearview mirror and it has those little words on the bottom that says things may look, larger than they appear. Social media is taking, extremism, things that exist in society, and they are massively amplifying them, which normalizes them, which is, as Patrice says, that's when it really becomes dangerous. When people start to think, wow, I didn't really think this was the way things were, but everybody else seems to think it, so now I guess I do too. The normalization of extremism through a system that is distorting information, that has to be fixed. The second thing is, Patrice used the phrase, or I think it was Hari used the phrase, we have to reclaim some space. So local media, local journalism, this country has made a commitment and recognized from the beginning that an information system was critical to making a functioning democracy. That's why the Postmaster General was a cabinet level position, because everyone needed to get newspapers. And that's why we have a postal system that delivers at a low rate to everywhere in the country. From there, we have always claimed a certain amount of the media space for the public. Libraries were established in every community through grants from philanthropy, through the Carnegie Endowment a long time ago. So there is a moment now when we have to reclaim some public, locally owned space in the communications environment systems. That is, Hari says we have a choice about how they run and how they're regulated. It is time for public to reclaim some of their own space for local communities to ensure that there's another source of news. And by the way, the platforms, the rail systems that are making all the money on moving everybody's information around right now, we're talking about, Facebook, last year getting close to 30 billion net profit. They should be required to chip in a little bit, make some room among their profit and among their platform for locally owned news generation that can be widely distributed by those platforms without filter and without distortion. I think that in there's a mix and an answer that would give us something of the kind of different world that Hari was sort of pointing at, that it doesn't have to be this way. This is all about the choices we make.
And we just have a minute or so left. The Biden infrastructure plans includes monies for broadband, so we can expand the reach to local rural areas. Good thing. What are the challenges? Hari.
Yes, I think it is a good thing. Like, building the infrastructure is important, absolutely, to sort of like increase the reach. I think one of the things is that it's not so much that we talked about how we had this like crisis of disinformation because of the speed and the scale, and of course that speed and scale is afforded by the internet. But the solution is not to block access to the internet for people at all, right? But having that speed and scale is good. The solution instead is to figure out, how do we design the kind of marketplace of information that actually works for people as opposed to working for companies, right? And so, yes, I think the infrastructure is absolutely important to reach into all communities across the country. But this question of design, I think, is a critical one that we still have to answer.
Patrice, in just a couple of seconds, the last word with you.
I think it's going to require courage on all of our parts. Courage and this commitment to our communities and saying, I live here, I want to be here, I want to make this town safe for everybody, and I'm going to find people like me who are going to do this. And, we have a resiliency guide that we build that can help get you through it to start the process. I think there are many ways to begin, but begin and take that step. And there are really good people around you who want to do this too. And that is a force that is incredibly powerful. We've seen it over and over again in our country, and I hope we can start leveraging that in a way that we haven't, to fight this deep challenge in our country.
Thank you so much, Patrice O'Neill, Laura Quinn, and Hari Hahn. Thank you for your insight, and also thank you to our producer, Joel Cohen, jack of all trades and master of all as well. Also, a big thanks to Teresa Collins, Whitney Coe, and Dee Davis and the rest of the team at the Center for Rural Strategies. And take care, folks.
And thank you, E.B.
Thank you. Thank you, E.B.
Hey.
That was a great conversation, y'all. Thank you so much.
So
we've got...
There was so much more I wanted to ask.
Thank you. I know. We could have talked for a long time. But we're going to keep going. And I want to let folks know that we've still got a couple more wonderful videos from across the country for you to check out. Some more musicians, and those are going to be wonderful. After the close today, we still want you to hang around because there will be some breakouts coming up. Those start at 5 p.m. Eastern. So there are 4 concurrent breakout sessions that will be happening this evening. If you registered for them already, then you will receive an email very shortly with a Zoom link to join those 5 p.m. breakout sessions. If you have not registered, it is not too late. You just go to the Rural Assembly event site and grab the Zoom link from the breakouts page. I think we're also going to be dropping that that site link into the chat here. So feel free to still register. Also, if you registered for happy hour, if you're interested in more networking and some good fun and rural pop culture happy hour, then we've got that here for you at 7 p.m. tonight, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you've not registered for that, again, it's not too late. Go to the Rural Assembly website. If you have registered, you'll get an email here shortly. I do hope everyone will stick around for what's coming in the next couple of minutes here, and then also we'll return tomorrow. Please do return tomorrow. We've got a full day of incredible programming. We're kicking off the day with a song this time. This morning we had, or earlier this afternoon, we had a poet, Nikki Finney, speak. Tomorrow we're kicking off with a song from Sonora May, and more panels, more breakouts. So we hope to see you there. Oh, and one more note. I want to let everyone know that I did see that a verdict has been rendered in Minnesota, and we should hear what that is around 5 p.m. Eastern. So we'll keep a lookout for that. I know you will be too, so we'll be thinking of all those things. So 5 p.m. is when that's supposed to be shared with the world. Take care of yourselves. Thanks for hanging in there.
My name is Judy Jennings, and I'm the owner of Peddler. I'm on the co-op of the food co-op board, and right as coronavirus hit, having a way for people to get groceries safely. And so we piloted this program, which ran for a month and a half, I think, volunteer-based. There was like 20 volunteers, and we would personally shop for them. They would call us with their order and then delivered their groceries to their house. I was laid off and was looking for something to do, and just loved the whole piece of it, organizing, talking to customers, having, being kind of this middle person that helps food access. And so that's kind of how it came about, and yeah, I've been just enjoying it since. Beautiful, organic, local greens. And I also borrowed a rock from Lisa. I'm returning that.
It's amazing. It's amazing that she took a problem and came up with a solution that fit what she wanted to do. I mean, she really cares about the environment and bikes, doing things with pedal power, and she really cares about people getting good food. So, and she has the personality to not only have the enthusiasm, but the organization and the determination to follow through with something that takes a lot of time and effort, especially at the beginning. So.
Yeah, I was thinking actually on the way here about why I value local so much. My history, to talk a little bit about that, I come from a really big city in Japan called Osaka. And the reason I moved to Port Townsend is, I think, the scale and the inspiration that comes from being able to reach one another and know your farmers, know where your food is being grown, where, in the city I was just pretty much lost. I didn't really know where anything came from. I was just, running around just making money and spending money. I just value that I could say thank you to the person who made the beautiful product.
I've shopped at the co-op for over 30 years. So not being able to get there was really was a disaster. And then she started this business and I was a godsend.
So yeah, we've been delivering since. But I think because of, this like limited time of human contact, I do enjoy it more. And I think my customers enjoy seeing me and talking about a little bit about their day in, this brief moment of coming and going. And besides, essential groceries, I think there are items that just bring us joy. And so when I see somebody purchasing, not just milk or eggs or whatever, but something for themselves and can imagine their smile, that brings me joy. And I think especially like any moments that I could feel joy in this pandemic is so important for us, to see bright things and to enjoy that moment.
The Royal Shakespeare Company aims to produce shows that address the human condition and brings attention to social issues affecting our rural community of East Tennessee. We try to make Shakespeare accessible to all audience members. Shakespeare is often put on this pedestal, but in reality, he was very rural. He was born in a small village. Farm life and community living would have been a part of his identity. He wrote plays about the upper class and royals, but throughout all his plays are common men who often had all the answers, yet no one listened.
Sonnet number 75. So are you to my thoughts as food to life, or as sweet seasoned showers are to the ground. And for the peace of you I hold such strife as twixt the miser and his wealth is found. Now proud as an enjoyer, and anon doubting the filching age will steal his treasure. Now counting best to be with you alone, then bettered that the world may see my pleasure. Sometime all full with feasting on your sight, and by clean starve it for a look. Possessing or pursuing no delight, save what is had or must from you be took. Thus do I pine and surfeit day by day, or gluttoning on all, or all away.
Almost everything he wrote is relatable. We talked about commoners, we talked about royals, we talked about family. There are tragedies, there's comedy, there's joy, there's grief. It's all relatable if you know the language. So in an academic sense, I didn't like it because I didn't have anybody that introduced me to it and taught it to me the way Kobe did. And once I grasped that, it's just like any other play or drama or theater, but it's just so much more, the richness, the depth of it is so much more enjoyable. And it's all relatable. And I didn't know that. I just thought it was way beyond me and I could never grasp it. But they're doing the same things we do now.
Although we are a Shakespeare company, we aren't afraid to perform newer plays as well. Using Shakespeare as an inspiration, we find plays that better address the issues facing our community. After the protest this past summer, we looked at our own community and how we can address the issues of race. We quickly put together a reading of Nat Turner in Jerusalem by Nathan Allen Davis that follows the storyline of a slave in the 1800s who led an uprising and is now being forced to give a confession and information about other uprisings happening in other states.
The signs, Thomas Gray, they are everywhere. The uprisings will never cease until injustice ceases. Your children will never be safe until injustice ceases. The low, no matter how low you make them, will see the signs in the sky that they should rise. And if you blind their eyes, they will hear it in the calls of birds, in the howling of the wind, in the barking of the dogs, the wolves, in their own howling, in their own songs of grief. They will hear the signs. And if you stop their ears, they will feel the signs in the vibrations of the earth itself. To cease injustice is your only recourse.
We followed this reading with a panel discussion where we invited youth activists and community faith leaders to discuss how we can grow as a community and become closer through all this. We had so much success with this that we decided to make it a yearly thing that we call the What Now series. In May, we have a second installment of the What Now series with a production of Natural Shocks by Lauren Gunderson, with a panel discussion to follow that will discuss resources for abused women and highlight other women's issues in our rural community.
There's so much hurt, so much polarization in the country. But for me, it's Go America.
I would self-identify as leaning left.
I'm more of a moderate Republican. I'll be real with you. And we could be real in this room.
Hi, we're Cody and Alex featuring Sam Warren. And today we're going to play an original song called Push On Through.